Okay. Great.
And hello, everyone. Welcome to How to Research, Write, and Publish a Solutions-Focused Book. It's brought to you by the Solutions Journalism Network. I'm Michelle Faust Raghavan. I'm the Equity Initiative Manager for SJN, and I'll be your host for this hour. My colleague, Julia Hotz, or Jules, will be moderating the chat and elevating your questions towards the end of the session. Today, we are very fortunate to be joined by Linda Villarosa and Andrew Ware. They're going to be talking to us about their books and their process, but we'll speak to them shortly. But first, we're going to introduce you to one of the founders of the Solutions Journalism Network and our CEO, David Bornstein. David is one of the co-authors of the Fixes column in the New York Times. His books include How to Change the World, Social Entrepreneurs and the Power of New Ideas, The Price of a Dream, The Story of the Grameen Bank, and Social Entrepreneurship, What Everyone Needs to Know. David, welcome.
Thanks, Michelle. Hello.
Let's go ahead and get started. I want you to please briefly define solutions journalism and tell us a little bit about what goes into that process.
Sure. So in its simplest definition, solutions journalism is just rigorous reporting that looks at responses to social problems and how they work. And it's, the idea is really looking at who's doing it better is sort of an operating question when you're looking at a problem. Is anyone doing it better and who's doing it better? And then really getting into using reporting, not sort of feel good or puffery or hero worship or single bullet stuff, but really rigorous reporting that looks at how people are trying to respond to this problem. What are the results that they're getting? And what can we learn from it? And so in a way, it's a form of explanatory journalism that we sometimes often call a how done it story, really looking at the how-to questions that get to the really the nuts and bolts of how an idea is working. That's really where the insights are often buried.
Thanks so much, David. Do you see a big difference? Today, we're going to be talking about books, writing books, publishing books, but do you see a difference between writing a solutions journalism article for a newspaper or magazine as opposed to putting together a whole book using the practice?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, when you are writing a book, first of all, you have to find something that can sustain your interest for 3 years as a writer. So there has to be, and then you have to figure out a way to actually create a narrative, I think, in my experience, that is really driven by curiosity. How is this thing going to work, this idea, this response? What are the ideas that I'm going to learn along the way? And in some ways, a lot of traditional journalism and at the article level has really constructed the idea of conflict around an argument or a debate or a disagreement. I think what really fuels solutions journalism and what creates it, what makes these stories read well and engage people is the curiosity that they generate that really helps you, the questions that really the book or the article begins with. And so in a solutions journalism book, at least in my experience, the quality of the questions and the sort of the persistence of the questions that run through the book are often, in a way, it's like, you think of these TV shows like Law and Order, or even a book like Harry Potter. How is Harry going to get out of this mess? How's Hermione going to get out of this mess? These books are strung along with how-to questions all the way through. And it's a great way to transmit information in a way that the mind people just really engage around. So I think that's one of the key through lines for me.
How did you know that you were first doing solutions journalism, either in your books or in your reporting?
Someone told me. I didn't know it, actually. It was actually a Columbia Journalism Review article that came out, I forget what year it was. It was written by Susan Benish. And she asked me a question. I had written a book about the Grameen Bank at the time. This was, gosh, more than 20 years ago. And she was the first person that I ever saw use the phrase solution journalism in an article. And I remember reading it after her article came out and thought, oh, that's an interesting notion. So, we didn't invent it. We just stole it.
Well, and the rest is history. Thank you so much, David. I'm so glad that you joined us this morning. So let's go ahead and meet our author panelists. Welcome, Linda Villarosa and Andrew Ware. Linda Villarosa is a journalist, editor, author, and educator who contributes to the New York Times Magazine covering race, inequality, and health. She has won numerous journalism awards, including a National Lesbian and Gay Journalist Award for Excellence in Journalism, and her upcoming book, Under the Skin, Race, Inequality, and the Health of a Nation, will be coming out later this year. Is that right? Later this year? Okay, will be coming out soon. Andrew Ware is our senior Australian public servant with degrees in politics, law, economics, and public policy. Ware is the director of a children's education charity in Australia. His first book, Solved: How Other Countries Have Cracked the World's Biggest Problems, and We Can Too, was published in several countries around the world last year. Welcome to our panelists.
Thank you.
So let's just go ahead and get started. I'd love you to just briefly in 30 seconds, around 30 seconds, give the audience a sense of what your book is about. And Linda, do you want to kind of give us a sneak peek, even though we're still in the publishing process?
Still in the writing process and revising. So my book looks at why for centuries, Black people have had worse health than most people of other colors, and definitely white people in this country. And the idea is threefold. And one is the environments that we live in, the neighborhoods and communities, which have been harmed by racism and have made the neighborhoods unhealthy. Two is racism in the environment harms the bodies of Black people. And three is discrimination and bias in the healthcare system itself. So that's what the big idea is.
Andrew, your book came out last year. Talk to us a little bit about, like, really briefly, what it's about.
Sure. Solved is based on the premise that somewhere in the world there's another country or another city that's successfully tackling the problem that we're trying to tackle. And by exploring what others are doing, by looking around the world and getting under the skin of their experience, that there's a lot that we can all learn from that experience as well to inform our own responses. And I should also just point out, I have another book coming out in September called Recovery, How We Can Build a Better, Brighter Future After a Crisis. And it adopts the similar methodology, and it really looks backwards though in history, exploring how countries and cities recovered from past crises, such as natural disaster or pandemic, recession, or war, and ask what we can learn from that experience, and explores that experience. So it's a similar sort of methodology, and I've learned a lot along the way from doing the first one that's informed the second one.
And in this time of climate crisis, I imagine this is going to be really relevant to all places in the world.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah. So I'm going to direct my first question to you, Linda. Much of your work has been focused around racial disparities in healthcare. And I wonder if your upcoming book is really drawing on your prior reporting and then expanding on it into a full book, or is this just a totally new drive?
No, it's expanding on the work I've already done. And the reason it's so late, I mean, now I used to say, oh, it's a year late. Now it's even more late, because things kept happening. And so first, the 1619 project, I was part of that. Now it's a book too. I'm just finishing revising my essay for that book, which includes COVID now. And so, all of that changed what I was doing. And so I hadn't planned to go back to the 1600s with this problem. I was starting more like at the end of slavery. And then I realized from writing my essay, oh no, I have to go back further. And then COVID happened and I ended up reporting on that. So then I thought, oh, wait, I have to put that in. And if the book had come out on time, I would have missed that. So now I'm trying to pull it all together, and it just got a lot bigger, but it's definitely an expansion of all the work I've ever done.
And there's no limit in the things that we could really be writing about and reporting out when it comes to health disparities, for sure. Andrew, in your book Solved, you chose to take several case studies to highlight. How did you choose those case studies? And did you have a hard time narrowing that focus?
Yeah, choosing the case studies was an interesting one. Firstly, it needed the book itself needed to include a breadth of case studies from around the world. It would have been really easy to focus on to not look too far beyond Scandinavia, for example, with countries that are doing a great outcome. But it was important that there was a breadth of experience in there. What I did as a methodology was starting with some of the outcome data, so looking at some of the data sets from the OECD or the World Bank or World Economic Forum, and ask the question of which countries are achieving the best outcomes in the world, or which jurisdictions are achieving the best outcomes. And then this is where it got a bit more, the dark arts of this became apparent, which was when it was about digging around, trying to find a really interesting story to tell, get under the, to dig around and find an angle that I was able to explore, a thread to pull on that actually made a really nice story, and finding the right interviewee subjects that really could bring a story to life was a really critical part of that as well. And yeah, and to some extent it was about making the story, finding the right story really was as much as about an important part of the process as leveraging the hard data.
How long did it take you to do that process? It sounds very labor intensive.
Yeah, it was my first book, so I spent about a year putting together a book proposal. So it was really, I spent a lot of time getting the proposal right, understanding, making sure that I understood who the audience was, what the sort of competitors in the market were, really trying to position it as a business proposition ultimately, making sure that I had something to sell, because I didn't have an agent, I didn't have a publisher. I was really trying to pitch the book in the right way. So that took about a year, and then the book itself then took about another year to write after that. So it was a longish process, or it felt like a longish process. The book number 2 has been a little bit more truncated.
Yeah, I can imagine. So we actually got a few questions that were sent in by our audience members before the session started. And I want to tell our audience, all of you out there, if you've got questions as they come up, please go ahead and put those in the chat, and we will have some time for Q&A at the end, but we're happy to start gathering some questions right now. Our audience member, Angela, sent in this question ahead of time. It feels like solutions are always evolving and changing. When did you know it's time to start researching and vetting some solutions and then focus on that writing and publishing? And I'm going to focus that to you, Linda, because it sounds like that many of those things came up in your whole process with this book that you're working on now.
Well, I think what happens anytime I write an article or anytime I speak about my work, people start to get, it sounds really horrible, like, oh my God, the end of the world. And so, so then I quickly shift and say, no, I'm very positive about what's, what can happen in the face of, problems that are entrenched entrenched in long term, because I see things changing and I see things happening and I see people making a difference. I see ideas that are, people are experimenting with, and many of them are as far as the problems in the healthcare system, many of the people who are making the biggest difference are medical students. And so that is super inspiring. So I end up kind of digging into the solution part because I realize that usually that I haven't done a good job of it, and people I'm making them really sad. And so I'm like, no, I just used to being an old school journalist sometimes and forgot that, I'm supposed to do, I've been trained in solutions journalism. David's my God, but still, sometimes you just don't focus on that. So Andrew, I love your books. I'm going to read them because of the importance of starting at that point. And that's really great.
Excellent. So I wanted to ask you a question, Andrew. We got a question ahead of time from audience member Michelle, and I think it really particularly applies to your book, although I'll pose this to both of you. When you were writing, who did you think your target audience was? I mean, did you really mean for that to be for the general public? Did you have that in mind? Or were you thinking more, I want NGOs and governments to learn from this so they can make change?
Yeah, like in a lot of ways, I was writing for people. Firstly, I was writing for myself. I was really I think the thing that drove me was curiosity. As David said, it was a real passion project, and really, and a lot of at the start of the project, I didn't know the answers. I really wanted to go out and explore the world and discover those answers, and it was a journey for me. But in the craft of writing, I was really clear about who I was writing for. I was writing for a general audience. I wanted to see my books in an airport bookstore at the front. I wanted the sort of book that people could pick up and feel like they could read on the plane, without being too dense and too serious. There's a lot of public policy books out there that have got great content, but are really, really boring. And I didn't want that. And so what I was picturing as I was writing was a dinner party somewhere with a whole bunch of people. I was picturing an educated group, a university educated group of people roughly my age sitting around a table having a conversation saying, hey guys, I read this book on the weekend. It had this really interesting fact in it, and it said this and that, and then the sort of thing that would get a dinner party conversation going. And that's the sort of picture that I had in my mind as I was writing. I used as a bit of a template, and in a lot of ways was books like by Freakonomics or some of Malcolm Gladwell's work. The sort of easily digestible, accessible piece. So no overly technical writing. It had to actually have a story running through it. It couldn't just be my voice. So that's why I wanted to use the voices of my interviewee subjects who were more expert than I and had their own journeys to tell. I was merely curating the various voices to actually bring out the story. And I had to learn how to do this because I'm a public policy practitioner by trade. I'm not a journalist. And for me, the policy part was the easy part. It was the actual learning how to tell a story like a journalist that I found the most critical part of that learning journey for me.
In your heart of hearts, is there someone who's working in government that you hope will read this and make some change?
Oh, absolutely. And I was really, it's funny, I sent a copy of my book to Barack Obama. I sent a copy of my book to Bill Gates. I sent a copy of my book to the head of the World Economic Forum. I sent a copy of my book to the Prime Minister of New Zealand. I've been trying to get it out there. I'm not sure how much response I've received, but at the point, you've got to give it a go, don't you? And the point is, you want your book to be read, you want your book to be influential. The whole idea by writing this book was by putting it out there, wanted to in a way change the debate, change the discussion, change the political landscape a little bit. And as I was writing, I was challenging myself to go bigger, go bigger, go bigger. And what's the biggest topic you could, so how to solve all the world's problems was about as big as I could get. So that was the topic for the book. And then obviously the subsequent challenge from that was how do you tackle a problem how do you tackle a book like that? And so it was bite-sized pieces. It was case studies that aggregate up. And that was a fantastic journey to go on.
Linda, as you're writing your book and with your other books, do you ever really think of this is the person that I want to read? Who is your target audience?
Well, I think that I used to start at, and for my book for the beginning, I was sort of like doctors, other healthcare providers, policymakers, college professors who didn't agree with me. So I was always arguing in my head, I'm going to show them that this is right and that I am right. And I'm, because I get pushback from these ideas. Then I started talking to other people, not so much writers, but researchers and other scientists who are more in the public policy, more progressive. And they were like, we've long been trying to prove this. They're just, it's just an endless cycle of trying to get people to believe this. So then I realized when I was talking about some of these ideas, people said I had no idea. And I realized, yeah, I do need to, stop trying to convince people who are super argumentative and just have people that I'm opening their mind or showing them this. And so I did pitch it down, kind of like Andrew was saying, to a place where it's just kind of like the general public. I really like talking to students, both college and high school. you know, and people who are saying, I just didn't know all this. And other people said, you know, I was thinking this, but I didn't have anything to read more about it. I was thinking that a lot of this, you know, these problems have to do with racism, not some genetic problem of the Black body, not something that Black people are doing wrong. But I just didn't know how, you know, where the information would be about this. So now I'm trying to be that.
Hey, Linda, that was really interesting, because I thought as I was going on my journey of writing, I kept thinking that what I'm writing is so obvious and, you know, and something that I've been delved in for so long, it's barely worth saying. But actually, what I realized was that I've been up to my neck in this content for so long that actually things that I took for granted were actually new and novel and interesting for the reader. And actually had to really cast that off, and actually say, well, actually this basic insight or this very common anecdote or whatever that I take for granted, there's actually value in putting it down on the paper and providing a readily accessible source of data or a source of information for the reader, because they find it useful.
I agree.
I think that you raise a really important thing. I think that's some of the power of solutions journalism, in that it gives the writers, when we're talking about books, or journalists, if you're writing for a paper, for radio or television, another angle to look at the way that the things you're covering all the time. David, would you like to chime in on that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's almost always the the most undercovered part of any story. I mean, you know, we used to say when we started the network, the problems scream and the solutions whisper. And in a way, it's true. I mean, the problems are always clamoring for attention. You know, usually way more about the nature of the problem than about the different approaches that are being taken. And there's also a really interesting thing that we've seen with solutions journalism, which is that, you know, the public can only read 3 or 4 stories about how bad a problem is before they're sort of ready to sort of say, I mean, even if they can get to that much, but there's almost like a potluck quality to the solution story, which is like, there's different ways into problems, and you can write. And that's why when you're reporting a book, and I'm sure you've seen this, Linda and Andrew too, you can be looking at 10, 20, 30 different approaches that people are taking to try to address the health disparities that you're focusing on. And it's sort of additive. It's interesting to see the different approaches that people are taking and how they intersect and how they're working in very, very different ways, or with very, very different populations, or through different distribution channels or whatever. So there's something about the solutions reporting approach that, you know, as a writer, it just opens up, just widens the lens of things that are possible stories to cover. It creates new leads, it creates new angles of entry into it. And, you know, for dealing with really hard issues, it's an on-ramp. It's like an emotional on-ramp that people can take to get handles onto a hard story. If it's just all problem, most people are, you know, increasingly avoiding the news because of that. So that's a really important piece to remember as well.
David, I think the interesting thing there is that you look at the shelf space in an average bookstore in the politics section, it is books about problems. And actually, books about solutions is actually a really easy way to differentiate yourself. There aren't many of them, and yet there's a appetite for them. So, you know, I think I started off with the presumption that I was sick of reading books about problems, and you go to the average bookstore, it'd be 90% problem, problem, problem. And actually the publishers are really interested in books about solutions because it actually enabled that differentiation.
I think that's a really important point, and it takes us to some of the questions from our audience. People are really wanting to know, like, are publishers generally receptive to these types of book ideas? And I guess I'll start there. Linda, can you jump in?
Well, I was noticing one of the questions is that how do publishers deal with your work that you already have? And then how does that differentiate from a book you're writing? And so what happened with me, I could have done a book on maternal and infant mortality, and I could have done a book on HIV/AIDS, and I actually could have. I stopped talking to publishers about either of those 2 books because I realized, wait, this is a bigger problem, and there are different solutions, but that they kind of mesh together if I think bigger. And even as I was working on the proposal, my agent is really great. And I did the proposal and it was a little bit heavy on maternal and infant mortality. So then I broadened it out. And then the original title was Under the Skin, Race, Inequality, and Health. And then she goes, I saw her put on Health of a Nation. And I'm like, okay, I cannot write about, I'm scared. Don't do that. That's too much. She goes, you have to go bigger, go big, go big. You'll impress the people. You have your breadth of, I was like, but what if I don't have that breadth of knowledge? And she was just telling me, you can do it. And I'm so glad I did that because it's pushed me to go bigger. And to really go beyond this individual articles that I've written and to just broaden out to bigger themes.
Speaking of going bigger, how much reporting did you have to do to get that proposal together to be able to pitch this book or other books?
My proposal looks basically nothing like the book I'm writing because it just went all over the place. Not nothing, but it's very different. And in parts of the proposal, I was totally overpromising, and then just was like, the editor's like, well, what about that? I was like, oh, right, yeah, that's gone. But I have this other thing that's good. It didn't take me long to get the proposal together because all I needed to do was do what the agent said, pull together the thinking that runs through most of my articles into one big thought. I also, before I wrote this book, I had my little secret side gig for a while, had been to do book proposals for other people, ghost them. So I like book proposals. I'm kind of good at them. And so putting together the book proposal was easy.
What tip would you give to our audience? Most of these people are folks who are interested in making their own book proposals. You're an expert.
Well, a book proposal really is an outline for your book. And then it's selling yourself and selling your own so-called platform. And so, like the better you do your book proposal, the easier the book will be, unless you're me and you keep changing it. But that is a really important tool. And there's lots of, there is a book literally called How to Write a Book Proposal that I used to use.
I used it.
Yeah, we all use the same thing. So it's really just, plug and play, I guess. So that's how you start. And it's just a really good exercise in general to write a book proposal, because otherwise, when you're ready to start writing your actual book, you'll be lost.
Yeah, it's such great information. Andrew, for
Michelle,
you,
can I jump in for 1 second? Just in terms of the publishing process, the publisher's reservations is always the question, is there a market for this book? That's really the number one question the publisher has. And so you can demonstrate that there's a market for a book through your magazine articles. And in fact, as you're building up the reporting that leads to the book, you're also creating a community of people and connecting to communities of people that you get to learn about. So by the time you get to a proposal, you can have a lot to say about the audience for this book. You may have seen the response to articles you've written, which speaks to it. You may have seen the number of people out there that themselves have audiences for this kind of stuff, people that you may have reported on or connected in the fact finding. So all of that is helping to make the case, which is the publisher's number one interest, that we'll sell enough copies to at least recoup our costs, which is their main concern. And so that's Linda had extraordinary responses to her magazine articles, so I'm sure the publisher, your publisher, was very confident in going deeper.
Yeah, so a lot of the publishers had the magazine articles on the table when I went to the meetings, because they were like, yeah, we believe in you already.
Excellent. So Andrew, you're not a journalist, and you read the book and jumped into this. How much reporting and research did you have to do before you were able to create that book proposal?
Yeah, the book proposal was largely desktop research, drawing on the reporting of others in a lot of ways. I would find short stories that others had written to sort of help illustrate the type of story that I could build out and build on as case studies, for example. But that was really a platform. The critical thing that made the big difference for me during the book proposal stage was the sample chapter. And that was really where I invested a lot of time and did my own original reporting and spent a lot of time, because I was an unknown writer. The sample chapter made all the difference. being able to demonstrate that I had what it took to actually. I'd published quite a bit in terms of articles in newspapers and trade press, etc. But doing a long form chapter, 6,000 or 7,000 words, to be able to demonstrate that was fundamental, was probably more important than the proposal itself. And I should just say too that from my publisher's point of view, I was really lucky to be blessed with a great publisher. They weren't looking at this as a transaction. Yes, they wanted to see the initial book was going to land well and was going to work, but they also wanted to know. They were also interested in investing in me as a writer, not just for one. They weren't. I mean, it was a deal for one book, but they were also interested in exploring what could I grow into, what could I become, and wanted to see. And as my first book did okay, it was about how do we build an author profile? How do we build reputation and into second books and beyond? And that preparedness to invest over a long term and nurture me a little bit was a fantastic part of that journey. I'm not sure if it'll be the same everywhere, but I had a fantastic publisher in that regards.
So you did stories that covered solutions from all over the world and many different stories. How did you tie them together? How did you make them one cohesive story?
Yeah.
You talked a little bit about that before, but could you talk a little deeper on that?
Sure. I mean, so for example, my sample chapter was diving deep into Denmark and Denmark's approach to tackling climate change and carbon abatement, and showing, for example, how Denmark had managed to grow its economy enormously at the same time as reducing per capita carbon emissions by half, for example. And it was a really, really interesting story, but also went everywhere from health outcomes in South Korea, which are leading to the longest life expectancies in the world, or education outcomes in Singapore, which are amongst the world's best, or innovation in cities such as cities in the US. In a lot of ways, tying it together was done through insight that I gained through the actual writing process. Didn't come together a little bit to the end. But really strong themes emerged. The importance of trust, for example, the importance of addressing inequality. Some of those themes that really came through almost in every chapter really led themselves to more global solutions towards the end. And so what could have been a disjointed and fragmented collection of anecdotes, or case studies, became a series of case studies that actually led the reader inevitably towards a conclusion and a set of synthesized policy responses. But I didn't know necessarily what they were going to be while I was writing. It did take the process of writing to actually discover those to some extent.
Thank you. Linda, I want to kind of have you talk about that. How do you, when you're taking this huge subject like racial health disparities, so many things to talk about, as we've mentioned, how do you create one narrative theme and tie that together through a whole of the book?
Well, I think what happens with me is I'm not so organized of a thinker. I'm just like really excited about a lot of things. So I really rely on editors. My agent is really good at it, as sort of helping me shape things. I'm good at finding narratives and interviewing people and having ideas and, getting excited, but I often have to be reeled in. So I'm one of those people who, when I was thinking about the publisher to go with, I thought, who is going to be the most hands-on editor for me? I kind of am sorry about that now. My editor's really focused on me now. But no, she's great. I'm kidding. But because I need help focusing, and it's hard. It's hard when you get it, when there's just so many interesting things to write about. There's so many angles on the subject that I care about. So I often need help being, reeling in.
We've got a lot of great questions from our audience. I'm going to encourage you, if you're in the audience, keep them coming. We're going to come to those questions very shortly. David, I wanted to ask you, there was an audience question that was sent in ahead of time about, deciding, is it better to write a book about multiple solutions or focus on one single solution? And you've had experience with that. Could you talk a little bit about your thoughts on that?
I don't think that there's one is better than the other. I really think based on the nature of the thing you're looking at. I mean, the things, and I also noticed another question, maybe I can speak to that other question as well. The question was, how do you actually find a publisher? How do you get this going in the first place? And how do you fund it? And, all this stuff. So how do you find an agent? So when I wrote my first book, which is about the Grameen Bank, which was a single organization, was the sort of the focus, although there were many ideas in it. I had only been a journalist for a few years. I had 2 years reporting for a local newspaper under my belt in New York, but I didn't know how to find an agent. I certainly didn't know how to fund a book and all that. And so there were a couple of things that were helpful. One is this idea of sort of slicing the bologna thin, as one of my journalism teachers we used to say, which is basically take a story and turn it into many different articles and figure out lots of different newspaper articles, magazine articles, so that you can create a stream of funding for yourself as you are reporting the book. The other one was like my competitive advantage when I was starting out this book on the Grameen Bank, which is a bank in Bangladesh that lends money to poor people, was I was young. I didn't have kids. I didn't have a mortgage. I could actually go to Bangladesh for a year, which was something that, people working for major newspapers or who were much more established in their career couldn't actually do. They couldn't spend 6 months in villages at the time in their life. So my competitive advantage was my backpack, basically. And I think for a lot of young people starting out, that's your advantage when you're competing against a book market that has people who are much more established than you are. You can go and get stories that they can't. In terms of funding also for solutions journalism, there's a lot of grant funding that could be available. I got grants for both of my books from different organizations, and learning how to sort of raise money from philanthropy for a book project is a totally doable thing, especially if it's a solutions oriented book project. I mean, you have to figure out ways, you have to understand the ethics of that as well. And there are fiscal agents and all sorts of organizations out there in the world that can help you think those things through. And then really in terms of finding an agent, one of the things that you actually can do is you can go to bookstores and read books on a similar subject. Authors almost always thank their agents, and you can see who are the agents that are interested in these kinds of subjects, and you can find out where they work and you can write to them. And that's actually a very viable way of finding an agent for a book, which is really the first step in the publishing process.
The other thing to say about agents is there are many more than there used to be. So there's been a lot of movement between editors and agents and things like that. So people that used to be editors, as publishing has changed, and they're big giant companies, and there's fewer big companies. There's just a few really big ones and imprints within them. So as people left editorial positions, then they became agents. There is an agency that I just saw. I recommended it to someone, and I looked, and it's like, oh my gosh, there's like 5 former magazine editors here and a couple former book editors here. And so it's not as hard to find an agent. And I like that idea of looking at books similar to yours and seeing who agented those books, but also asking people like my writing students, who I'm super excited about. I've done a couple writing workshops, and they still get together and they talk about where they are in the process and share information with each other. And I think that's very useful, including finding yourself an agent.
Andrew, can you jump in on this as a newcomer in finding public? You didn't have as much of that information as the folks who've been doing this for a while.
Yeah, that's right. I went down that journey. I think that the notion of looking in the acknowledgements section of similar books and chasing agents is a fantastic one. But in the end, I found it quite challenging to find an agent. And in the end, the strategy that I found most effective that worked was leveraging networks in the end. So finding out who in your network has written a book, who in your network has a friend who's written a book. And so in the end, a friend of a friend was a moderately well-known author in Australia. And I got an introduction to her, and she read my sample chapter and was prepared to introduce me to her agent, and the agent was prepared to take me on. And so I think your networks is a really important thing to tap. And I think your networks, more broadly are really, really critical, I think, in doing a project like this, in finding interviewee subjects, and subjects to interview, or things such as an agent. I found the network was really critical all the way through, and I couldn't have done it without a network, really, in a lot of ways. So I think that question of David's question of actually asking what is your comparative advantage in writing this book. Mine wasn't being young and having a backpack. I've got 4 kids and I've got a full-time job. I wasn't going anywhere, it was the fact that I'm deep in the public policy space, so I didn't really have to learn a lot of public policy. It was second nature to me. So that was my comparative advantage, and I've got a decent network. So it was being able to leverage those things. For others, it'll be other assets. If you're an established magazine writer, you've actually, or you're a journalist, you've actually already got a platform to a large extent you can leverage. Some people have got more time, all of those things. Everyone will come at this from a different angle with a different set of strengths and a different set of perspectives. And I think being conscious of that and then working to leverage it is a really critical thing.
Thanks so much. This is our time for you to ask your questions. Julia Hotz, Jules, you've been gathering many of the questions. Can you bring some of those to the surface?
Sure, absolutely. This first one comes from Lisa Lewis, and it's for Linda. And she writes, given how much it seems that your book is taking on the task of educating the audience, she wants to know how much of the book is focused on this, the education piece, versus a call to action for the audience.
Most of it's the education piece. There is some, there's a solutions lens, there's a call to action, mostly near the end. And in the beginning, actually, the introduction and the afterward are kind of like call to action-y and kind of more emotional. But most of it is in the education part. Also, I have a lot of narratives, and my own, I write some in the first person. A lot of the things that happen to other people in the healthcare system and in life happen to me and my family. So I am, writing in all kinds of different, through the eyes of all kinds of different voices and experiences.
Thank you so much. That's a great segue to our next question, which is first for Andrew from Sharon Friedman, which is, as you're interviewing these policy experts, how did you learn to take those sort of policy style interviews, that policy voice, into a more narrative approach that would be engaging for a reader?
Yeah, I should just say at the outset, I wasn't just interviewing policy experts. I was also interviewing community members, everyday people. So, for example, I wrote a chapter on gender equality in Iceland, and I started off by interviewing friends of friends of friends who are parents raising a 3-year-old child in Reykjavik in Iceland, and I interviewed them about their experience of being parents in Iceland, for example. And I think getting a variety of perspectives, not just from experts, but also from those impacted by the policy work, is a really critical part of that story as well. But I would literally take the transcripts of my interviews, go through and find out the interest, go through and highlight the bits that were interesting, the bits that the reader might want to know about. And before starting writing each chapter, I would literally write down a number of cue cards, and I'd probably end up with 20 or 30, and each one would have an interesting thing, an interesting thing that probably is one of the building blocks in that chapter. And then I would just arrange them all on the floor and try and say, which order, what's the structure and the narrative of this chapter? And getting the structure right was a really critical thing that was probably one of the hardest pieces, both for the book as a whole and for each individual chapter. How do you structure this? Because there's so much content. There's so much interesting stuff. There's what's the narrative? How do you balance the journey between the focus on the individual stories that are told by individuals versus the global perspective versus the bringing it home for action, and so you often I'd have to find myself having to stand back and say, what's actually interesting for the reader? What's actually novel? What's breaking new ground? And how do I structure all of that? And lots of little bits of card on the floor was the answer, I think.
That's such a great visual. I'm wondering, David and Linda, could you speak about your process too? Laura Barakekris wants to know, how do you narrow down the issue from pages and pages of interviews and research into those bits? Do you also have a floor process like Andrew does?
Linda, do you want to go?
I just am an outliner. I just have an outline for the, I have the proposal, using the proposal as a template for the book. Then with each section, I don't really have chapters, more like these giant sections. Then I just have an outline for each one that I create ahead of time. And then, so I've done that for all the sections, and then I go back and fill in the blanks. And then it changes, but I'm very structured like that because of not having a lot of self-control. I need to have that kind of structure to work within.
I did so many interviews for my first book, the one on the Grameen Bank. I mean, I had literally 1,000 handwritten note page because I was doing it all in villages in Bangladesh with, without electricity in many places. And but what I would do is I would reread, 20 or 30 notes or a bunch of interviews, and then I would close them and I'd sit for, a half an hour, and then I would write down notes just about the stuff that I remembered from those interviews. And so that was a way of filtering out what's the stuff that really made the most emotional impression on me, that really stuck with me. Sometimes I would wait even, like I'd go back even 2 weeks later, I'd write a bunch of notes about, I'd spend maybe a month in one village. And then 2 weeks later, just at night in another place, I would reflect on what I had remembered from all those experiences in the village. And it was fresh enough that it was still fresh, but it was also, it had receded a little bit in my memory. So really only the most important things stuck out. And that was a way of, it's kind of a filtration, a kind of emotional filtration process that was based on how much stuff had really stuck with me and resonated. And then like from those things all added up. And then later on, there were like 100 pages of reflections that then got boiled down into stuff that ultimately became the outline of the book.
Linda, we have a question from Oscar who says, how do you manage material for a book that's also part of your beat that you're also writing articles around? And do you hold back some of the material from your interviews because you want to use them in the book? Or do you sometimes use similar or the same quotes for both? How do you make all that work?
That's interesting and hard. I know, I was like, do people want to hear this again? And then I was editing the 1619 today. I was editing the piece that's going in that book that was already an article. And now I'm like, wait, I say that in my own book too, but my own book's so much bigger than all of this. So I don't know. I'm just like trying to, and I feel worse about it than I noticed the editor didn't notice. Like, I was like, are you sure this isn't repetitive? And she's, and she was like, no, it's okay. People are interested. Just give a little bit more backstory about how you did it, and then you'll be fine. And so that's what I'm writing much more in the first person than I had planned to, because I need to have some kind of scaffolding to sort of pull together how I did some of the stories, and people I notice are really interested in that anyway. So I'm just leaning into that part.
Yeah.
Linda, editors are amazing, aren't they? I mean, I just didn't really have a true appreciation of how incredible editors are until I wrote the first book, and my editor managed to extract more from me than I ever thought possible. And really, the answer, she just constantly kept going, more. We need to go deeper. We need to go more on this. That's really interesting, but we need more. Give me more on this. And I found the editorial process a really magical but extraordinarily demanding part of the journey. I mean, I thought when I got my first draft in that I was home, but actually there was probably just as much work at the structural edits and then the copy edit stage as there was writing the first draft. It was but it made the final product so much better. And I didn't appreciate how incredible editors are.
Andrew, Oscar also asked you if you got any fellowships or grants or other compensations that kept you afloat while you were working on the book.
No, I didn't. I had a day job. So, I like in government. So essentially I was working at 5 o'clock in the morning and 10 o'clock in the evening, working in and around my day job. Yeah, so, and my day job was sustained me, really. And I discovered that you can actually write a book whilst working as well. For me, writing didn't have to be a full-time occupation. It could complement in a lot of ways the thinking and the work of my day job. But I guess that's going to depend on the perspective that everyone brings, and some people will need to immerse themselves fully. For me, it was more about leveraging the thinking and the work that I was doing in my job. So it was complementary.
We've got about 8 minutes left. Julie, I think we probably have time for 1 or 2 questions. Can you pull up the next question?
Perfect. This question comes from Lawson Hunter. And they write, what happens when you're partway through a topic only to find out that someone else has already written the book you wanted to? In other words, how do you make the case that your book is distinct from others on the market?
That happens a lot to me with articles. And so I used to just get really depressed and call my editor and said, I just don't want to do this anymore because I see that there's nothing new for me to say. So she was like, okay, stop it. She just pumps me back up. But with this book, it was funny. It happened like about 8 months ago. The agent called and she said, Arlene Geronimus is writing a book and she's going to get a deal with blah, blah, whatever publisher, and that publisher had wanted your book, but since you went with someone else, then they're taking her book now, so you have to hurry it up. And I said, this book is not competitive with mine. And I called Arlene, who is coined the term weathering, so the idea that the lived experience of being Black in America, or any kind of sort of high effort coping against harm causes harm to your actual body. That's her theory. And I said, I talk about Arlene in my book. And I called her, I said, are we writing the same book? She goes, oh my God, no, I'm an academic. I'm not like the same kind of writer you are. And I said, I'm a writer, I'm not an academic. And so then we just like basically held hands over the phone and said, when your book comes out, I'll blurb you, you blurb me, like we'll have readings together or whatever. And I went back to the agent and the editor and I said, this is not the same and don't do this. It's stressful. Neither one of us think. And so there's not even a lot of books about these topics. So it's fine to have more than one. We're not in some competitive, wrestling match. It was annoying actually, but for 1 second, I let it get to me. And then I thought, no, this isn't the same.
But Linda, timing does matter though, doesn't it? Getting the timing of the release right matters. Book I'm writing on recovery from COVID, for example, it's coming out on 31st of August, but if it were to delay a year, it would be completely irrelevant for the context in which the book's going to drop. So I think that hustle at the right time is a real important factor. And my first book dropped at precisely the wrong time, 2 weeks after we all went into lockdown from COVID and all the bookstores shut, that timing question really goes a long way towards getting a success or not. And you can't control it to a large extent.
My plan is just go as big as possible. So no matter whose other book comes out, it's like, well, mine's bigger. Mine goes.
Yeah, that's good.
I mean, this also gets to a marketing question that someone asked as well, because the exact same thing happened to me. Just when my book was in process, I heard that there was another book on the Grameen Bank, and there was a very legitimate question of like, how many books can the American market take on a bank in Bangladesh, right? So, but it was interesting because what I learned out of that experience, and this actually speaks to publishing, is that, I mean, publishers used to do marketing, and if you're with a major publisher and you have a major book, that will happen. If you're not with a major publisher and you don't have a major book, it probably won't happen very much at all. And so it really ultimately falls back on the author to be the spokesperson for their book in all the different extraordinary ways that are available now that weren't available, before the internet. And to that point, there are also a lot of publishers now that do 50-50 deals with authors around royalties, acknowledging that the author is the best salesperson and should probably get a lot more of the percentage of royalties than they used to get in the past, which is only 10 or 15%. And so if you're the kind of person who has a platform and you want to build up a social media or Facebook or presence or whatever, or you like doing talks and you are ready to travel around and do that, there's a lot of publishing options other than sort of the traditional publishers where you could, do better for yourself financially. So that is like, we're talking about competition. In some ways, being out there in the world and being the spokesperson for your book is the opportunity now for a lot of fresh voices. And it's much more available than it was 20 or 30 years ago because of social media.
My family had a publishing company a few years ago, and we published a book about Audre Lorde by her last partner. And so I sat down with the partner and I said, she's older. I said, tell me every single place you could go speak and where we could sell at least 25 books. And so it's like, okay, your alma mater, Hunter College, where Audre Lorde was. So we sold a lot there. We had a big event there. So she was so exhausted by the end. She lives in the Caribbean, came to New York. She had so many places where she had events. And I said, just make sure there's either you or me, but between the two of us, we have some connection so we can sell books. And it was intense. We wrote articles. We did every single thing you can think of. We used social media, everything. And it really was tiring, but that's how we sold, we were just a publishing company of me, my mother, and my sister. So we needed the author to really help us.
We have gotten a lot of questions and we still have plenty more, and we're running out of time for that. But I do want to just leave our audience with one more thing. What is the one thing that you wish you knew before you started working on your book project? And I'll start with you, David.
Oh, someone else go first. I have to think about that.
Andrew.
I wish I hadn't spent a full year on a book proposal and had just gotten started much earlier. Just get into it, I think, is probably the advice I would give to me a couple of years ago.
And Linda?
I think I wish that, I don't know if this isn't what you asked, but this is the thing I was trying to say, I want to say, is that I feel much more confident now because I took more time than I did at the beginning. Like, I didn't even want to write a book. I felt kind of pushed into it and just, then I was nervous and then I wasn't sure. And now I realize, no, I have a lot to say once I started doing it. And so, I had to get over that. I mean, people were saying I had more to say than I thought I had to say. So now but I had to build that up and get that kind of backbone for myself and that kind of confidence in my own work over the years and in my own abilities.
So important that self-confidence is probably one of the big pillars in writing a book to begin with. David, what's your one thing that you wish you would have known?
I think it's very similar. I think I had this idea that I needed to be an expert. And I think when I got more comfortable in sort of writing from my bafflement and my questions and using a book to explore questions without having to be this, this idea that I had in my mind of sort of some expert who has something to say because of deep truth that I know, but more a set of questions, a set of research, put things together in an interesting way, and then hand it over to the world and see what comes of it. It doesn't have to be the final word. I think just having that a little bit more humility around the whole process is actually freeing.
Wow. So we are out of time. I'm so grateful for everyone. I want to thank our audience for all your amazing questions. I know we weren't able to get to all of them, but we applaud you for asking them and for being here today. I want to thank our guests and our CEO, David Bornstein of SJN, our authors, Linda Villarosa and Andrew Weir. We truly appreciate you enlightening us about this whole process, which can be so baffling to many of us. I'm Michelle Faust Raghavan on behalf of the Solutions Journalism Network. I'd like to also thank everyone for being here. Everyone, so many thanks. We want to tell you that we've got lots more information. If you're here and you're asking, what is this Solutions Journalism thing? Go to our website, solutionsjournalism.org, and read more about what solutions journalism is. And also go to our database. We've got more than 11,000 stories at the storytracker.solutionsjournalism.org. And once again, thank you all for joining us. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle, for your excellent hosting. And there's some questions about, will this recording be sent out? Yes, it will. It's going to come on our blog, the whole story. We also very much encourage you to check out these excellent books that these three authors have written and are working on. Thanks so much again, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.